Welcome to our first class in Hilchos Basar. We'll be starting with Yoreh Deah, Pei Zion, which is chapter 87 in the Chelek of the Shulchan Aruch called Yoreh Deah. And you can either follow along in your Shulchan Aruch, or you can follow along online using an app like Safaria. We're going to begin with the first seif, the first halakha in the Shulchan Aruch, in the section titled Be'ezer Basar Nahig Din Basar B'chalav, which types of meat are included in the prohibition of being cooked with milk. Ve'heach nikra bishul, and how do we establish the boundaries of what is considered cooking? So we're going to learn a lot. So the first halakha quoted in the Shulchan Aruch is Kasuv b'Torah lo tavashel gedi b'chalev imo. The Torah says one should not cook a baby goat in its mother's milk. Shalosh pa'amim. This is stated 3 times. Echad le'isr bishul. One time, that pasuk means a prohibition on making cooking. Echad le'isr achila. Another time to make a prohibition on eating that mixture when it's cooked. Echad le'isr hana. And a third time to prohibit benefiting from that cooked mixture. V'hotzi achila b'lshon bishul, and the Torah expressed the term eating by using a language of cooking to tell us she'enu aser min haTorah ela derech bishul, that the Torah has prohibited this mixture when it comes about through a manner of cooking. Aval midrabanan aser b'chol onion, but rabbinically it's prohibited in every type of situation. The Ramah adds a comment on here and says, Kol basar b'chalav she'enu aser min haTorah mutar behana. Every type of mixture that is cooked of meat and milk that is not prohibited by the Torah is prohibited from benefit. So let's talk about the parameters of the cooking meat with milk. Let's start with the sources first of all. The first one comes from Shemos, it's chapter 23, verse 19. Okay, and it says, Reshis pikure ad mascha tavi beis Hashem elokecha lo tavashel gedi b'chalev imo. Okay, so at the end of the parsha over there, Rashi explains that this means lo tavashel gedi, one should not cook, which is af egel v'keves b'chal gedi. So Rashi explains, first of all, that's not limited just to a baby goat, but also types of small cattle and small deer and small lamb as well. She'ein gedi ela lashon vlad rach, because the actual word gedi simply implies a young and tender calf. Because we find a number of places that this language of small and tender animal is referring to that. And after situations, you have to talk about goats. So sometimes it's called a gedi izim. And this example is, for example, Radam Bereshis 38:17. So Rashi brings a few examples of this. You're welcome to go and look at that Rashi over there in Chav Gimel Yotes to see more about that. Okay, the pasuk is also repeated again in Perek Lamed Daled at Chav Vav. Okay, so that's repeated twice in those 2 cases, and the third time is in Sefer Devarim, chapter 14, verse 21. Lo tochlu kol neveilah. One should not eat any animal that has died. Lager asher bisharecha titanena v'alchala. You shall give it to the sojourner who dwells amongst you, and let them eat it. O mechor l'nachri, or you can sell it to a non-Jew. Ki am kadosh ata la'Hashem elokecha lo tavashel gedi b'chalev imo. For you are holy to Hashem. You shall not be cooking a kid in its mother's milk. Okay, those are the 3 times. Now the Gemara in Chulin says the following. The Gemara in Chulin is 115b. Devei Rabbi Yishmael Tana lo tavashel gedi b'chalev imo shlosh pa'amim. So the statement the Shulchan Aruch brings down comes from this section of the Talmud, comes Gemara in Chulin, and it's a brisa from in the name of Rabbi Yishmael. Echel Isra Achila, Echel Isra Nav, Echel Isra Bishul. So that is the Gemara and that is what the Beis Yosef quotes in the Shulchan Aruch. Another source here is the Gemara in Nazir, and it says that the Gemara has a question related to it, but it asks a similar question, and it wants to know about something else known as Tam K'Ikr. This Gemara is brought down in Nazir on 37a, and it wants to know when the flavor gets attached to something else. Okay, so is Tam K'Ikr something that we could learn from Basar B'Chalav, meaning that when the flavor of the milk goes into the meat, that means in all situations when flavors go from one thing into another, such as the flavors of the grapes going into bread, it's therefore is the Torah prohibition, because the Torah prohibits flavors taking over the object that is impacted by the thing. And the Gemara answers, Chidushu, it's a unique law. My Chidusha, what's the novelty of the approach of it? Ilema the Haylu Chudei, B'Haylu Chudei Sharei. Each one of these things is on its own permitted. The meat, when properly prepared, is permitted to eat, and milk also is permitted to eat when it's derived from a kosher animal. And when they're put together, boom, it's prohibited. Kilayim Nami, any prohibited mixture, same thing. That's, wool's okay on its own, and linen's okay on its own. Put them together, makes a treif, right? However, if I soak milk and meat in the milk all day, that's permitted by the Torah. But once I go ahead and cook it, that prohibits it. So that again is another statement of the Talmud to say that when they're cooked together, that's the prohibition. So the Torah makes the following assessment based on these Gemaras. That the prohibition of Basar B'Chalav, it says Lo Tavashel Gedi B'Chalev 3 times. Okay, and it tells about those 3 prohibitions that we've mentioned. Okay, and it mentions specifically the language of Bishul. And this is the language that the Beis Yosef uses in the Shulchan Aruch. He says, Hotzi Isser Bishul V'Lashon Achil Lo Marsha Einu Asr Min Torah Ela Derech Bishul Avol Min Devaron Asr V'Chol Einyan. Okay, so that is the statement that is recorded in the Shulchan Aruch. Okay, and the Beis Yosef points out that in the later halachic work of Torah Sabayas of the Rash Rabbi Shalom ben Aderes, Rabbi Shalom ben Aderes lived about 100 years before the Torah, but he says this rule is recorded there in exactly that format. Okay, so therefore there are 3 prohibitions in the Torah from what we've seen here. There's a prohibition on eating, there's a prohibition on cooking, and there's a prohibition on benefiting. Okay, so why didn't the Torah just write each one of those, right? Don't cook a kid in its mother's milk. Don't eat meat cooked in milk. Don't try to benefit, whatever language of benefit we would want to use. Really, it wraps them all into the language of Bishul. Okay? So why is that? Why is that? So it's an interesting thought. So the reason why is to tell us specifically that there is a unique character to this prohibition, is that it is rooted in the cooking itself, or a manner that resembles cooking. That's why it's written this way. And that's what the Torah is prohibiting. Okay? And only when they are cooked does this Torah prohibition attach itself. Okay? And that's what everybody seems to say. And there's also enclosed in the book the Isser V'Heter, who precedes Reb Moshe Isserles by a couple generations. So the one of the interesting things about it is that written next to it is Ki Am Kadosh Ata L'Hashem Elokecha. It's the reason why we should be even more careful about it is because it's a testament to our own holiness. Okay, so in the statement of the Gemara, by the way, Rashi makes an interesting point over here where it says that if you soak it cold milk all day, Rashi says that's to say, which is that you technically could just let it soak in there, and you're not violating a Torah prohibition on its eating, and the Torah only prohibits it when you cook it, and that's even if it gives flavor over. However, rabbinically it's prohibited. So Rashi does make a statement on the Gemara itself. So that's the source of this halakha for the Beis Yosef. Okay, so what are the different ways in which we discuss the prohibition of cooking? So this is a very involved thought process over here. We're going to discuss quite a bit of it over here. Okay, so let's talk about the different ways in which this prohibition of cooking attaches itself. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at when we're saying that the Torah prohibits only cooking, it means that the cooking has to be done in a primary vessel, the one that sits onto the flame. Okay, so it has to be a pot that was heated over a flame. Even if it's currently not on the flame, but the contents of it, in this case the milk, or conversely the meat that was cooked over a flame. Okay, so that's the first thing. And if you drop them into each other, mix them, that's going to become prohibited. And then the food inside of it that's cooked in it, that's going to be prohibited both by eating it and by benefiting from it. So you can't cook them together, and then the mixture itself afterwards is going to attach the prohibition of eating and benefiting once that happens. Okay, and that's going to happen if it's cold meat into hot milk. Okay, as long as the heat of this initial pot is above the temperature known as Yad Soletispo. The entire mixture of meat and milk together is a Torah prohibition. And on this thing there's an idea which we'll develop later known as Tata Gavar, where the bottom item influences the top through an exchange of temperature. Okay, we'll talk about how important that is as well. And that becomes a Torah prohibition. And also pouring from a Kli Rishon. So pouring from this initial one, so you heat it on the flame and you have, let's say, hot milk in it, and you take it, you pour it onto something else, that's going to prohibit it. But let's say it just splashes, okay? So let's say it doesn't come attached in its perfect flow from the Kli, it gets attached. So let's say it's not attached to the fire, the food that was on the fire itself. So this actually has a machlokas to it. So some of the commentaries on the Torah, like the Prisha, and then there's other works as well. They also quote Tosfos, and Tosfos quotes the Ri, and then there's Ran as well. And all of them are quoting Rabbeinu Tam, that Rabbeinu Tam himself, one of the Rishonim, holds that this is considered cooking it, and it's like cooking it inside of the pot, and therefore the entire piece of meat that is impacted by it is going to be prohibited by Torah law. Okay, and why? And Rabbi Kiva Eger writes on this halacha over here, and he's quoting the Pri Chadash. He makes a little note on the side of the Shulchan Aruch over here that Yoreh, that pouring from one onto something else, is still considered cooking by Torah law. Okay, now there's a difference is that the Ron points out over here that if the two mixtures were both liquid, so let's say you had cold meat gravy and hot meat gravy and hot milk. Let's say they have that, okay. Or if the top one, or if the mixture was mixing hot and cold together. So one is hot. So let's say the milk is hot and the meat gravy is cold. Okay, so this is considered a regular mixture, and it's cooled immediately, and this is not prohibited because it doesn't have enough power to do all of that. He points it out as a possibility of not being a Torah prohibition. It would still be prohibited rabbinically because it's probably going to be more than 60 times and add the flavor to it, but it may not be a Torah prohibition. And other people comment on this statement of the Ran, like the Pri Toar, that this actually is only going to be a rabbinic prohibition. Okay, and other Achronim follow that as well. However, some people say that this is a suffix deraisa. They're not sure if the Torah prohibits this or not, because maybe it cooks it a little bit, because in many cases, if I were to take, let's say, like hot cheese onto cold meat and put that on top of it, it only goes in a little bit, so I could take that a little bit off, but here I can't really take the little bit off that's impacted, so maybe it is, maybe it isn't. So they're not sure. The Pri Megadim throws in his thoughts on this and says that it probably is a Isser Torah, and it is when you pour it, but the pouring doesn't stop. So it means you pour and you don't have sort of globs fly up, but it has an uninterrupted pour, kind of like you're pouring it out of a tea kettle, but here it's a hot milk kettle, and you're pouring it a little bit, okay? And if that doesn't stop, he's not sure if that cooks or not. So even though itself is a hot liquid, it's coming out of the pot, and he seems to feel that this is the opinion of the Rashbam when it comes to Hilchos Shabbos. If you look in Shabbos Mem Beis Amud Beis, and it's in Dibur Maskil Aval, that the Rashbam seems to imply that Yoreh doesn't cook at all, and so therefore he says at best I could argue that this would be a suffix. Okay, so that's the thoughts of the Achronim on that case. So everyone agrees when you cook them together, no problem. But if I'm starting to pour, it's not clear. Maybe it's only rabbinic, and maybe it's only a suffix Torah. So that's what some people come out with over here. Now, let's say you for sure go ahead and cut off, the glob flies out and lands on it. Okay, so for sure everyone agrees that there's a rabbinic prohibition with eating it. So that's what we see from this as well. Now, what if you poured hot milk into a kli sheni, okay, into a second cup, right? You cooked milk on the fire in that first pot. Now you pour it in a bowl, and the bowl or a cup now has milk in it, and the milk is hot. Like you can't put your finger into it. You can't see it. It's above Yatz Letesbo. So does that prohibited by, if you put meat in there, would that be a prohibited action by the Torah or not? No one to put the meat in it. God, I can't cook them together, right? So if I put the meat in there, that's a Torah violation. No, don't put the meat in there. And they go ahead and cook. Doing the act of cooking would be the one thing. And then afterwards, after you cook it, is there an Isser Bishul, and an Isser Chila, and an Isser Hana after that fact, okay? And they can't eat it and can't benefit from it. So here's the rundown. So later on, the Mechaber himself, the Rav Yosef Karo, writes in 105 that if it's kli sheni, it's not mavashel. Okay, it doesn't count. And then some people say that it not only is it not mavashel, the tastes don't even exchange. And some people also say that it does go in and out a little bit, but if the prohibition only is a small amount around the edges, called a kadei klipa. And so therefore we should be careful with this in this case. Okay, so that's what the Mechaber himself writes. He also takes a similar approach when it comes to Hilchos Shabbos. He says that in Hilchos Hagalas Kalim, this is in Hilchos Pesach, that when you are koshering Kalim, if they were used as a kli sheni, he says you can kosher them by putting them in a kli sheni. So that's his opinion. Okay, so the Mechaber himself holds that even by Pesach and clearing out and koshering chametz, that the hechsher is only kli sheni, which means that it's possible to kosher at low levels of heat. So that is the Beis Yosef's opinion, and many Svardim follow that approach today. We'll get back to that at another point. However, the Ramah disagrees in Hilchos Pesach, and he says that when you have something that is at the heat level of a kli sheni, that he somewhat agrees with the Beis Yosef, but some people say that for Pesach we're worried about the heat of a kli sheni, and it's best to be stringent about that. And the Mishnah Berurah writes in those cases, so therefore if you use something with chametz and the use is only a kli sheni, okay, you don't actually put that thing on the fire, you can be lenient in those cases to kosher it, but that's assuming it's not been used in the past 24 hours. And you can rely on the Mechaber according to Chachmas Adam in the case of where it's really only going to need a klipa. Okay, so we're a little bit lenient on this for Shabbos and so on. Okay, that's the Mechaber of the Ma. Now, many people hold that kli sheni asers the whole thing. So in that approach, it's the approach of the Maharshal. Okay, he says that it does absorb the flavors, so this is a problem for Basar b'chalav. Okay, but the flavors won't go out into the other thing. They can't do this. They only go one way or the other way. They can't do both. And the Taz, also later on in Kufay, brings the Maharshal and says it's best to be stringent like the Maharshal, and the Chachmas Adam says that as well, and the Pri Chadash and the Bach. They're also stringent, and they actually argue even further that the taste exchange goes both ways. Okay. However, the prohibition is only midrabanan, and therefore it's not cooking it, so it's permitted to benefit from this thing, which means that you could sell it. Okay? But the Taz does say that, he says that it's entirely possible that if you heated up a knife in Kli Sheni and you add that with the cutting, that might make it mavashel. But that's his opinion alone. The Mishnah Berurah in Hilchos Shabbos says this is when everything is Yad Soletis Bo. And then he quotes a Chayadam that if it's super hot, that your hand will be scalded by it, everyone agrees that would be a problem. And this is argued by a few people as well, and that's how they hold. However, a number of Achronim disagree with that this chumrah of having it scalding hot has been addressed already, that this stringency does not apply to cooking, it was simply something that the Rambam applied something else. So it has to. There is no stringency they could bring from the Rambam in this thing. So at the end of the day, the Chazon Ish says that in Ikar Adin, it is a Kli Sheni is permitted, and nonetheless he says that we should be stringent, and he brings a proof that there is reason to be stringent in that. So that's with mixtures with it. All right, so that's what we're done with talking about pouring liquids on top of plates. Let's talk about some solid things. Let's talk about if you have solid things. One is meat and one is cheese. Okay, and the cheese is on the bottom. So we just talked about a concept as tata gavar. The bottom one heats up the top one. Okay, or if both of them are hot. And again, hot means they're above the temperature of Yad Soletis Bo, which you can't put your hand on it without it jumping away. Anything above 105 degrees Fahrenheit, okay? And they have to be lying one on top of the other. So everyone agrees they're prohibited. However, is it Torah prohibition or not? So the Pri Megadim says that if they're both hot and dry, it's a rabbinic prohibition, because without liquid, it's not cooking. However, the Yad Yehuda disagrees and says, no, that's still cooking. And the Yad Ephraim brings down that he's not sure, so therefore it's a suffix. Okay? So that's what they're talking about. Some people say the Pri Megadim is only talking about because they're in a Kli Sheni, but if you left them inside of their original thing on the flame, everyone agree that that's bishul. Okay, so something to think about over there. So lots of cases to be stringent. Now let's say you cook meat into a pot that has been used in the past 24 hours for milk. Now are you violating the Torah prohibition with that? Okay? So that is a Torah prohibition, and the Shach brings this down, but he brings it down in Siman Sadi Gimel 93:1. Okay, and the Pri Megadim echoes that here as well on the Shach. He echoes that in our Siman Pei Zayin, but it's in Pei Zayin Yud Ches. Okay, so that's what they hold. Now the Pischei Tshuva says something a little different. He says that it's entirely possible that this may not actually apply for our case, because even though it gets a dairy flavor in it, it's not actual milk in there. So maybe that's not the Torah prohibition. So that's what he says. But one says that maybe you could be a little bit lenient on that. However, most people seem to imply that when you cook them, it's still no good. Okay. Now, what if you had cooked something parv in the middle of a meat one in the middle there? So let's say you had dairy one and you cooked something parv and then cooked meat afterwards. The Pri Megadim says that that would be permitted after the fact. The Chazon Ish, however, says that it doesn't matter and it's still a Torah prohibition. And then the Shach here in our Siman, he says that maybe it is an Issur Torah and maybe it's not. Okay, so that's it's entirely possible. So maybe it is and maybe it isn't. He feels that this would technically be a stringency, is what he seems to say. Okay, let's see. Okay, he also argues in another place in Siman Samach Tes by Melicha that in many places the flavor is actually less than 60 times the volume of the actual thing, the object that's holding the flavor itself many times. So, it's also entirely possible so that it might not be, even though it prohibits it, because we're not sure how much flavor goes in and out, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there actually is a total prohibition with that. Okay, and a couple other things to point out over here is what about roasting? So if you roast basar b'chalav together, so the Pri Chadash says that that's a Torah prohibition. However, there's the Meiri who says that it's only a rabbinic. The Shevet HaLevi, a much later Acharon, writes that if you're not sure, you can take the lenient opinion of the Meiri to be lenient, and the Chaf HaChaim for good measure also seems to say a similar thing as well. Other Acharonim like Chassam Sofer and Chalkas Yoav, they differentiate between whether it's a fatty roasting or it's very dry, and we mentioned that just a minute ago as well. And so that's what they all bring down, that it should depend on whether there's any liquid involved. Frying, such as frying meat in a pan with butter. So some people say that this is definitely the Torah prohibition. So that's like the Pri Chadash, the Plesi, the Chacham Sodom. Okay, but this Meiri again seems to say that it's Machlokes Rishonim. So many people allow you to attach that Meiri to other people as well. So, but I would treat it as if it's an Isser Torah. So if you're not sure, you should be stringent. Okay, if you smoke something together or if you heat up something in hot springs. So what's interesting about that is that they're also not sure. So that's something else. So, but however, the Gra seems to imply that as long as there's heat involved transferring and there's a liquid, he seems to say that there should still be Torah prohibition, but they're not sure if heat from thermal heating is the same thing as using your own fire. Okay? So the Pri Chadash differentiates between smoking something, which is a Torah prohibition because you're generating the fire. Okay? However, if it's thermal heat, that is only a rabbinic prohibition. Okay? But some people even more lenient than like that. Okay, now if the stuff gets heated up through salting and so on, that's definitely rabbinic. Soaking it together is rabbinic, as we mentioned. Okay, and the Pri Megadim also points out that that when it's cooked like that, that whatever flavors go into a utensil and then come out into the meat, that would make the mixture prohibited by Torah law, even by and then as well that would even be even if it was soaked into the kli. So, however, some people disagree with that and are lenient with that. So we'll hold it here. There's a lot to take in. What is the Isser Bishul? What is Bishul? We have covered a lot already. So let's start with that, and we'll come back and we'll talk about what the minimum shear is and all those interesting things, and using electricity and such modern applications, and then we'll continue talking about this first siman in more detail as time goes on. Thank you for joining our class. Look forward to hearing from you, and remember to subscribe and get all the notifications for this year as well.